Our Bible word is Matthew 15, verse 32. Now Jesus called his disciples to himself and said, I have compassion on the multitude, because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. So we are in Matthew, and Jesus is feeding the multitude. This is the feeding of the 4,000. And the first part of Matthew, that is from chapters 4 to 11, that is where Jesus ministers to Israel. And the second big part of Matthew, that's from chapter 11 to 20, that is where there's this growing rejection of Jesus. But there's also this growing acceptance by his disciples. And that's our larger context. And part of this context is where Jesus is now. He's also by the Sea of Galilee, and now he's feeding this 4,000. And we know the story. As our Bible word says, Jesus says, they've been with me for 3 days. They must be hungry. I don't want to send them away hungry. We must give them food. And the disciples say, well, what are we going to do? We're here in the middle of nowhere. And so it's found out that there are 7 loaves and 2 fish. And then Jesus orders this crowd to sit down. We must also understand here, Jesus is like this manna that's fed in the wilderness to the Israelites. The new Exodus is happening. We must understand that the 2 main images of redemption that's used by the New Testament is the image of the Exodus. Moses led the Israelites from slavery. In a similar way, Jesus leads us away from slavery to sin, to death. But the second big image that's also used by New Testament authors is that this is the return from exile. Remember, the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians around 587 BC. The people were in exile in Babylon for about 50 years, and then they returned from exile to Babylon. And that's also another image that's used by the New Testament authors. People are in exile, so to speak, away from God, away from the covenant, a relationship with God. Now they're returning from exile to the promised land. In other words, to having this relationship with God through Jesus. Yeah, the main motif is Moses and his exodus from Egypt, where people also fed manna in the wilderness. Yeah, God's people, the new people of God is being formed. And yet Jesus is also the source of this new manna, this bread, etc., that's being given to the people. So just remember that also in the back of your mind when you read this. This is the new Exodus happening, this new event of redemption. People are being redeemed. In other words, they are being set free from slavery. And Jesus is the new Moses. He's the leader of the new Exodus. So Jesus orders the crowd to sit down. And then in verse 36, it says, he took the bread and he gave thanks and broke it. And this is also reminiscent of the Last Supper, where Jesus also did similar things to bread and wine. So it's also kind of, in a way, anticipating this fellowship, this Lord's Supper, this communion with Jesus. And then in verse 37, it speaks of the amount of loaves and fragments that were picked up, the baskets, and it explains there were 4,000 people that Jesus fed, apart from the women and children. So in and of itself, it's another feeding miracle of Jesus. But there were actually 2 of these feeding miracles, and they're only recorded, or both of them are recorded in Mark and Matthew. If we go previously, there was a feeding of 5,000. And you'll see that in Mark 6, in Luke 9, in Matthew 14, and as well as in John 6. But the feeding of 4,000, that is our current text word we're busy with here. That's only found in Mark and in Matthew. And now the explanation or the significance of these 2 feeding miracles is given in Mark 8, that's from verses 14 to 21, and Matthew 16, verses 5 to 12. That is where Jesus and his disciples, they were on the boat, and then Jesus warns them, be wary of the leaven of the Pharisees. And of course, they were confused. what is he saying we don't have enough bread? And Jesus says, no, it's not about bread as such. And he reminded them of the 2 feeding miracles. And he asked them, well, at the feeding of the 5,000, there were 5 loaves of bread. And how many baskets did you pick up? So they said, well, there were 5 loaves and 12 baskets of fragments were picked up. And Jesus asked them, okay, and with the 7 loaves, and when we fed the 4,000? So they said, there were 7 loaves, yes, and 7 baskets of fragments were picked up. So obviously there's symbolic significance attached to this. Now, there's no certainty about what it means. But scholars speculate is where 5 loaves were used and 12 baskets were filled up, it's referring to Jesus being the manna or the bread or this overflowing provision he provides for Israel. Because they say maybe 5 is symbolic of the 5 books of Torah, and 12 is maybe symbolic for the tribes of Israel. So there, God, through Christ, through Jesus, is providing more than enough bread or provision for Israel. And then in the second feeding miracle, there's 7 loaves with 7 baskets of fragments that were picked up. And 7 is a symbolic number for perfection or completion. And scholars speculate this is the bread that's provided for Jews and Gentiles. And they say also the first feeding miracle happened in Israelite territory or in Jewish territory, and the second feeding miracle happened in Gentile territory. So it's saying Jesus provides enough bread for Israel, but there's also development beyond that. Jesus provides abundant provision for both Jews and Gentiles. That is what the significance is. It's his teaching. And if you look at those passages in Mark 8 and Matthew 16, where Jesus explains the significance of this, it's in a way saying, do not follow the teaching of the Pharisees or Herod. That may refer to the Herodians, which were the Essenes, and they supported Herod the Great. Or it can also refer to Herod Antipas. There's no certainty about this. And then another place in Matthew, it's about beware of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So the main meaning here is that the Pharisees were just about them. It was about exclusivity, just providing bread for Israel. That was also the teaching of Herod, that maybe refers to Herodians. Alternatively, it can refer to supporters of Herod. In other words, from being very rigid and very closed off, it's to becoming too open and adopting foreign ways and foreign teachings. And Jesus is saying here, beware of being too exclusive, too small, and be aware of being just accepting what's out there in the world that comes from Herod and the Romans. That may be the meaning of it. But the main thing here is abide by the teaching of Jesus. Don't abide by the teaching of the Pharisees or the Sadducees or maybe followers of Herod or maybe the Herodians, the Essenes in other words, because Jesus is the one who provides bread and provision in abundance, whether it be to Israel or whether it be to both Jews and Gentiles. And that could be the symbolic significance of those 5 loaves of bread and 12 baskets on the one hand, and the 7 loaves of bread and 7 baskets of fragments picked up on the other side. The main point is the new Exodus is happening. Jesus is the leader, the new Moses of the Exodus, and he's the one who's providing manna. It's his teaching that is valid for all Israel, for all Jews, but also now for all Gentiles. And there's abundance. There's more than enough of this to go around to everyone.